Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. We are going to get started just in about 3 or 4 minutes. So this is the last chance to, if you want to go get some coffee or use the restroom, you've got a couple of minutes here. And actually, I think I'm going to grab some coffee myself because I just ran out. I was chatting with Bob. So I will be back in just a moment. All righty, I'm back. I assume everybody is still here. We've got another minute or so before we get started. So I know I've got Bob. You're here. You're working at home, and you're in Omaha, right?
That's correct. Yep.
And what's it like in Omaha today?
It's hot and humid.
Hot and humid. Well, we don't have humidity here.
No wind.
We've actually got a bit of wind today, and it's warm,
Yeah.
but it's been super hot here. Actually, hot weather is following me around. So if anybody is on my schedule where I'm traveling, you should beware, because I was in Ireland a couple weeks ago, and they actually had a heat warning take place because it was so hot there.
Oh, wow. It's probably going to be the first time that's happened in a while.
Yeah, I was surprised. But we had beautiful weather, right? Sunny, and for us, not super warm, right? Mid 80s or so, but
that's their heat warning?
yeah. I think it got to 24 Celsius, so that's about 82 or something, and 84. And they were putting on heat warnings, like you should go check on the elderly, make sure everybody's safe. So
that's a 6 a.m. some days for me.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. What was amazing in Ireland is that the days are super long. Like we were there in June, and the sun comes up like 4:30 in the morning.
Oh my gosh.
And it's twilight at like 10 p.m.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I didn't realize they were that far north. It was kind of amazing.
That messed with my brain. I don't know if I can handle that.
Yeah, it certainly messed with us because get done with dinner at 9:30 and it's still fairly light outside. So, all right, where are we at? So I think it's top of the hour. You ready to get started, Bob?
Yeah, I'm ready.
All right, let's do this. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on how DevOps can help you stay ahead of the competition. This is brought to you by Octopus Deploy and Redgate software. Now, a few things to just let you know, we are recording this webinar, and we'll send you a link later on this week with the recording in it. So if you do need to drop out, you'll still be able to hear the entire webinar. And then we will also send you the slide deck as well, so you don't need to worry about capturing screenshots or anything. We'll get that all out to you. A couple of housekeeping items just to let you know, we do have a question panel in your little control panel that's probably on the right side of your screen. If you expand that out, you're welcome to ask questions throughout the webinar. I'll probably hold those to the end and then discuss those with Bob, but if you've got something that you want to talk about, please let us know. And other than that, let's get started. So my name is Steve Jones. I'm going to kind of host this and manage the webinar. I run SQL Server Central, which is probably where a lot of people have heard of me, but I've been working in this business for nearly 30 years now in technology and over 25 years with SQL Server. So I spent a lot of time in big and small companies working on both development and administration and infrastructure. And a lot of the DevOps stuff are things that I've been doing, for most of my career, but we've now given it kind of a name or a way of describing it. So here's my contact information if you have any questions for me. But really, today, most of this is covered by Bob Walker. So Bob, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, certainly. So I've been, my name is Bob Walker. I've been developing. I came from a development background for probably since .NET 1.0 started roaming the earth. That's when I first started doing this. Really, DevOps is near and dear to my heart. I kind of started down this journey about 4 years ago. I didn't know it was called DevOps at the time, but it was just, I started adopting some of these practices, and like you said, you kind of put a name to it, like, oh yeah, we've been doing this. We just didn't realize we've been doing this. So.
All right. So Bob's information is here if you want to get a hold of him. And like I said, don't worry about capturing all this. If you need to, we'll get you the slide deck as well. So today, Redgate is sponsoring this webinar with Octopus Deploy, but I actually work for Redgate as an evangelist. And Redgate is a company that's been around for 18 years. I've known them almost that entire time, and I've been working for them for a little over half that time. But we're really a company that's building software tools to help you build software. That's kind of our goal. And lots of huge companies use our software, and we do our best to build these ingeniously simple tools that help you become better at building software, both with SQL Server and .NET. But we also support the community quite a bit. So I started SQL Server Central, but Redgate actually purchased SQL Server Central, and I came with it. But our goal is to help educate you and share information, not just about Redgate tools and products, but just any data platform really at this point. So our goal is to give back to the community and be a part of that. And so we sponsor lots of events, lots of conferences, user groups, and certainly webinars like this. Now, I want to set the stage just slightly with DevOps so that we kind of have this idea of what we're talking about. Now, there's this great quote from Donovan Brown, who's a principal DevOps manager at Microsoft, and he came up with this definition that DevOps is the union of these things that deliver value to our end users. And I had a few developers tell me, well, we all know that that's our goal, that we deliver value to users. And I agree with that, but DevOps is slightly different in that we want to change the focus of it's not you as a developer building software. You really have to consider the entire pipeline of building software, from the architects or project managers or business people that specify things, all the way through the developers and the testers and the infrastructure people, to the ongoing management of that for monitoring and backup and reliability and all of those things, and then how the customer feels about it. So it isn't about optimizing your job as a developer of just getting things done. It isn't about making sure that the servers run great from the infrastructure side of things or the DBA side of things. It's about ensuring that all of that works. And so you really have to think of it as a union of people and process and platform, product, tools, whatever it is, across the board of delivering this value to customers. Now, it's also a continuous thing. So we don't want to be in this point where we deliver something and then we don't want to change it for a long period of time. We want to be responsive. One of the things I've found over the years is that there's been no end to the things that I've built as a developer that really never get used by customers. And so I end up doing a lot of work that isn't useful, or I do work that they want changed in some way. And so the idea with DevOps is I want to deliver smaller changes to customers and then be more responsive to their feedback often. And so DevOps tries to give us this guidelines of how we can do that. It's not prescriptive. It doesn't specify things like a 2-week sprint, or we deploy every week, or it doesn't do any of those things. It's like we want to optimize the entire process. So maybe my job as a developer or my job as a DBA isn't optimized, but the entire process of getting value to the end users is optimized. Now, there are a lot of challenges of getting databases involved in DevOps. DevOps has mostly grown up, I think, in the application software side of things, but the databases are super important. I mean, I'm a data platform guy, I'm biased, but ultimately we understand that data really powers most of these applications. It powers most software. And as much as you software developers do some amazing work, the data is critical. And the vast majority of DevOps books and techniques and practices and blogs and all that stuff ignores the database. They really leave that to the side. And it's somewhat sad that that's the case, but the database is always a challenge because we have this stuff called data that has to be maintained. I have to maintain the state of my tables and my data throughout the process. Unlike with a C# application or web application or Java or Python, those I kind of can destroy the entire application and put a new version out. And if that's wrong, I can destroy that and put the old version out or a second new version, whatever works for me. I can't do that with a database. I don't get to drop a database and then add a new one back. I have to maintain state, which means that a couple things. One is I'm constantly evolving the database, which is a challenge because I can't drop what I've got. I've got to evolve into a new state. And then, the second thing is that because I'm doing this part of evolving the database, I've got to be super careful about not altering things in a way that loses information or causes data to be corrupt along the way. It's a very large challenge in many ways to try to evolve this database while the application is trying to evolve at the same time, and ensuring those things match up can be problematic. And certainly we all know if we have a problem with the database, if we lose data, change data, drop it, something like that, there are usually big implications for our businesses. So some of the things that happen when we're not doing DevOps is that deployments are difficult. I know as somebody that's been a DBA before, you get nervous and stressed and worried about deployments because we're not always doing the same level of testing, of automation, of repeatability and reliability in our changes for the database that we do in the application software, primarily because it's just much easier for the application software. So what we end up with is we make mistakes along the way because we're human. We often find that there's some risk level in changing the database because our development environments or test environments are mocked or they're modeled and they don't have everything that we might have in production. We certainly make changes in production because of expediency or necessity, and those don't often get fed back to the development environments. We depend on humans to spend time building scripts and reviewing them and ensuring things execute in the right order, even on the right machines. And so all of those things end up slowing down the database development process, and they create stress. And when we have that stress, what we tend to do is do fewer database deployments. We let more changes pile up, and then we increase the risk of something going wrong. We often don't have an easy way to roll things back, especially because of data. And in many cases, we often don't even know what the previous version of an entity or object looked like because we aren't following the same practices that the software development world does. Most database people still don't use version control. They still haven't built a reliable way of testing changes prior to them moving to some other environment other than just a human kind of glancing at it or testing an application and hoping they've checked everything. And so the database deployment process is still kind of a problem. And Redgate spent a lot of time here. Octopus spent a lot of time here. We're trying to make this easier for you. If we do build a process, though, and I'm not saying you have to use Octopus or Redgate products. There are definitely other ways to do this. We think we've built some compelling methods of doing this, but there are definitely other ways of doing it as well. But the important thing is if you build a process, then you have more confidence that any particular release will actually succeed and it will go smoother. And so Bob will talk a little more about this, but ultimately we have less stress for the DBAs and developers. We have confidence that all of our changes will go through smoothly. We do some testing along the way to ensure that we don't have these huge unexpected surprises. If anything, there'll be small, more data-driven issues. But ultimately, it builds a smoother process that everybody is more comfortable with, which means happier employees, which means they're happier to work there. And often it means we can get more work done. The other thing is by using a known process in something under the DevOps moniker, we end up with a repeatable, reliable process where we have instrumentation and metrics of everything that's occurred. And Octopus does a fantastic job of giving you logging so you understand exactly what happened. There's no more relying on the memory of a DBA or a developer. Instead, we have actual logging, which helps us with compliance. And so Octopus is in Australia, which has some data protection laws. Redgate is in the UK, and we're bound, at least for now, by the GDPR. In the US, we have HIPAA and PCI, and then actually California just passed a law about compliance. But plenty of us have industry regulations or standards like ISO, right? If you're an ISO compliant company, you may need to provide some information about what has occurred in your process. And so having DevOps in place just automatically includes some of that. If you follow the idea of DevOps, then you'll use tooling or you'll build a process that includes logging so you understand exactly what's going on, which helps ensure that you're compliant. And so with that, Let me flip over to Bob now, and I will let him take over and run the presentation. And again, if you've got questions, we've got the questions panel in your little control panel. Please feel free to ask them. And with that, Bob, take it away.
All right, thanks, Steve. Yeah, so today I'm going to be talking a little bit about my experiences with adopting DevOps in the real world. It's going to be based on previous examples, hopefully some real world examples. I want to let's click on that. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about our agenda first. Like I said, we're going to talk about some previous experience, start adopting some DevOps principles, getting started with DevOps, benefits, as well as roadblocks. And then we're just going to wrap everything up with some questions. And let's just dive right in. So talk a little bit about my time before Octopus Deploy. I recently joined Octopus Deploy it's been about 3-4 months ago as a solution architect. But prior to that, I was either a developer or an architect on these applications. These aren't the only applications I've worked on, but these are some of the applications that I worked on, and I wanted to use them as examples. One of the interesting things that Steve was talking about is having these very slow releases or large releases, and that was very much the case with me. Almost all of these applications, when I got there, had a quarterly release cycle, give or take. And by the end, for some of them, it went a little bit slower, and some of them went a little bit faster with some of these principles that we've applied. Everyone's very familiar with the software development lifecycle, and depending on your needs, you may or may not use one or all of these steps. But I like to focus it on more along the lines of the team responsibilities within that SDLC. And everyone's familiar with the development team. We don't need to dive into that too much. One thing I wanted to point out with operations is when I think about operations, I think not only just the web admins and DBAs, but I like to include support as well as security. They may not have their hands directly on the machines themselves making configuration changes, but they provide knowledge and they provide information that gets back to the development team. So we have to make our changes. At almost all of these companies I worked for, one of the things I noticed was we had a operations team, so a single operations team with anywhere between 2, 5, 10, 15 development teams that they had to support. And because of that, the operations team, their focus is more at a macro level. They were focusing on the systems, how are the statistics being, what are the applications doing? How many support tickets are we getting? How often is someone paged? Whereas the development team, they focus on more of a micro level. They know how the applications work. They know everything that there is needs to know about that particular application. And because of this different point of view and these different priorities, what you end up having is a very kind of contentious relationship between the two teams. I'm not saying that they don't get along at all, but oftentimes in the day-to-day interactions, what I'm seeing, and this is what I saw is very common, is you're seeing each other on probably the worst part of your day, because you have to go over and talk to the operations person. As a developer, I have to go to talk to my web admin and say, hey, my service is down. I need you to restart it. And the web admin's going, man, this is the 5th time this month. What's going on? Or a DBA is coming over and saying, hey, I just got paged last night for the 5th night in a row because of your SQL job that just failed. You need to fix this. And they're not trying to be mean, but it's just a very negative overall interaction. And what happens with all of this is you kind of have this lack of trust. And it's not intentional, I don't believe, but at the same time, it just happens. If all you have is negative interactions, you do have that lack of trust. And I'll give you an example. And this is when I worked on an electronic poll book. We had a multi-tenanted application. It was a reporting application, and it was just designed to provide aggregate information about an election. So what was the turnout at a particular precinct, at a particular jurisdiction? We had made a change for a customer, and we're ready to deploy that feature next week. So we go to the operations people, and in all fairness, as a development team, we should have gotten the operations people involved a little bit earlier, but we didn't. And we decided, we told them we're going to deploy next week. And they flat out told us no. They weren't very happy because the support people were going, we got people out on site support, and we don't have enough people to handle the increase in support volume. And the operations people are going, well, we're right at the limit in terms of what the servers can handle right now. We need to add more virtual CPUs and more VRAM. And we need a little bit more time to prepare for all of that. Well, because we'd made a commitment to the customer, it turned into kind of a fire drill for the operations folks, which I felt a little bit bad for. As a result of this, we kind of had this new policy that was put into place. Like, we need a 2-week notice for all our deployments or any changes that are going to be made. And that lack of trust slows everything down. And I believe that's what really contributes to this very slow development cycle. Steve was talking about in terms of database deployments. It's very slow. It's a very manual process. It's because we just don't have that trust in place. When I started working at one particular company, we had to fill out a Word document that was 50 pages long every time we wanted to do a deployment. And the operations folks, the web admins and the DBAs, they would take this document and they go, okay, I need a copy of this file from this folder over to here. I need to run this script in this order. I need to take this server out of the load balancer and do a deployment. It's a very slow process. And what ends up happening is you kind of expect perfection in these very large deployments. And you've, in fact, set yourself up for failure in that particular sense. And you have these very big bang deployments. And I saw this happen multiple times. It didn't matter what software development way that we did it. We did sprints, Kanban, or waterfall. It was just very large things that we had to do, these very large deployments that we ended up having. So it's kind of a perfect storm. For the lifting control application, we had a very large development team, and we were actually split into 2 separate groups. And we did quarterly releases. So one group was responsible for Q1 and Q3 releases, while the other group was responsible for Q2 and Q4. A group would do a release. They would be on support for a couple of weeks, handling any bug fixes, and then they would go off the rotation, and the other group would come on. The loan origination system, the first version of that was a legacy one, so we had quarterly releases because there wasn't a lot of trust. And the electronic poll book, that was a little bit interesting in terms of the actual poll book software, because it had to get onto the customer's device, whereas some of the reporting applications that we provided, those were more software as a service. So those would be 3-month releases, whereas the other ones might be 8-month or 6-month releases. But we had these very long software development life cycles that we had to go through, and these very big releases. And we had some unhappy users. That's not what they wanted. They provide us feedback. And this was something I thought was rather interesting. Our user went out of their way to provide us feedback, both good and bad. Sometimes it feels like it's all bad because they're like, man, this application sucks. But we need a little bit more information than that. But they would provide us this feedback, and we wouldn't be able to get to that feedback for quite a long time. And how long would a customer wait before that application is no longer relevant and they just start heading over to the competitor? Because unless you work in a very niche market, you have to worry about competitors and what they offer, because maybe they're able to handle that. Maybe they're able to release every month or every week or something ridiculous like that, where if you're releasing once a quarter, it's a very slow release cycle. The business owners, they're not happy because they're listening to the users send in complaints and send in other feedback and feature requests. And they just don't see it happening fast enough. And then as Steve started mentioning, now we have to really worry about security, not only data compliance and patches and penetration testing, but security is getting ramped up every year. As we saw, when I worked on the electronic poll book, we had to deal with a whole series of news articles and potential fears and everything like that. So, I mean, it keeps ramping up more and more every year. And that's really kind of where we wanted to talk about DevOps. And with that, we need to start building that trust back up. And I like Steve's definition. I thought that was a really good thing that he threw up there. This is my personal interpretation, and it feels like everyone kind of has their own interpretation of DevOps, very similar to Agile. Everyone has their own interpretation of this, but I like thinking of it as a development and operations team working together towards a common goal. And that common goal could be anything. It could be, hey, we're doing one release a quarter. What would it take to do one deployment a month? What processes and tools do we have to put in place? What issues do we have to solve? That's pretty big. What about just doing something about, hey, can we increase our response time more on our critical methods that we have? We know that this method gets called 50, 60 times a second. Is this performance enough? Or we're consuming way too many resources. We're consuming 4 gigs. Can we get it down to 3.5 gigs? Anything along those lines. But really just kind of picking a common goal and start building up that trust. But first, it's all about how do we kind of get started in this whole process. Because in some cases, at one particular company, there was almost no trust between the development team and the operations team. We worked on completely separate floors. We had almost no interaction with one another. So we really needed to get going and get started with that. And hindsight being what it is, I really wish I kind of did this approach, and this is something I would recommend. Just start very, very small. Start attending meetings. If you're a developer, go to an operations meeting. So say a support meeting or the web admins or the DBAs, and just kind of listen and learn about some of the concerns that they have, some of the common complaints, what's working for them, what's not working for them. You're not trying to solve all the world's problems at those particular meetings. It's just about listening and learning. And after a while, maybe you can pick a common problem, a small problem, and maybe use some existing tooling with that to solve that problem. And as an example, performance monitoring. So this was on the loan origination system that I worked on. And support started telling us we have reports of slowness in the application. And unfortunately, if anyone's worked in software development for any more than a couple of years, oftentimes you just get like a little bit of information, like that nugget of information. It's slow. Okay, what does that mean? Where is it slow? What are you doing when it's caused? What actions did you do that result where you're seeing the slowness or anything like that? The web admins, they're starting to see this information. They're saying, okay, the application's slow. And the DBAs, they're noticing this increase in resource consumption and what's going on. Well, thankfully, we had New Relic installed recently by our web admins. They knew the tool. They knew how to navigate the tool. They knew that, hey, this particular application, it's reporting some slowness and everything like that. But they didn't have context around what that tool is telling them. And that's really what the developers could provide. They could provide that context. And they could also train the DBAs on that context and how to use the tool and to provide this information. So by using that, we're able to work together and say, okay, we see these 3 or 4 methods that they're really slow right now. Those shouldn't be slow. Whereas that method over there, it's taking 45 seconds to respond. That's actually pretty performant and compared to what considering everything that it's doing. Because at that point, for this loan origination system, it was when someone submitted an application and it had to go through all of these various checks and Plinko charts to determine if the customer was creditworthy or not. 45 seconds was completely acceptable to the user. They were happy with that. But other parts of the application, loading in a customer's information, it was taking maybe a second or 2. That wasn't acceptable. So we were able to tell the web admins, okay, these are critical methods. We need to make sure that they're very performant. And the DBAs, they knew, okay, this one method might be called 50, 60 times a second. Well, we need to make sure that that is very performant. So we'll look at indexes. How can we maybe rewrite this proc if it's not performing fast enough? So they had that context. And we didn't form some sort of action group. We didn't completely restructure our organization. We just got together and we tried to figure out the common problem. We started working together. We started building that trust back up. And then after you go small, go medium, solve a larger problem. And this is where you start talking about introducing new tooling and new processes and maybe pick an application or a group. And as Steve said, that there's a lot of tools out there. I obviously have my personal bias towards Octopus Deploy and Redgate. I will pick them over VSTS release and DACPack any day. But the most important thing to remember is that there's a lot of tools out there. And really don't get stuck on a tool. Don't spend an inordinate amount of time focusing on, okay, this tool can solve this one very particular problem, and you do a pilot project and it works great, but it doesn't solve all the requirements for everybody in the organization. Don't get stuck up on like arguing, because really what it is you want to make sure that both people and tools are working together towards that common goal. A bigger problem that we had to solve was our automated database deployments. Our development team, we had a database developer on the development team, and he would spend hours manually creating our Delta scripts. And once he was done with creating those Delta scripts, he would copy them to a file share for the DBAs to run during the deployment. And the DBAs, they're pulling their hair out because we had an agreed upon structure and everything like that within the file shares, but there's no consistency between the teams. And they had to support 10 to 15 different deployment teams. And so some teams, they would do 1 or 2 larger Delta scripts. One team did, I think, a bunch of smaller Delta scripts, and there's no auditing or there's no testing of these scripts. Sometimes a script would be changed an hour or 2 right before deployment, or maybe even 10 minutes before deployment because we noticed something. And as a result, at the best case, our deployments were taking 30 minutes. Worst case, it could take 2 hours or more per development per team, per deployment per team. And if we're doing 1 release a quarter for an application, as a development team, we're not super concerned with that, just because, like, it's an annoyance. One night every 3 months out of our lives, we have to be on the phone. But the DBAs, they had to support 10 to 15 different teams, and there's 60, 80, 90 different applications they had to support, and that's 1 deployment a week, 1 to 2 deployments a week. And now they're talking about just a lack of a work-life balance because they're online 2 hours at night. And thankfully, our deployments weren't until 7 p.m., but now 7 p.m. to 9 p.m., you just lost your entire evening. What we did is we recognized that issue, and thankfully, we had a DBA who was a huge fan of Redgate, and they reached out to him and they said, "Hey, do you guys have an automated database deployment tool?" They said, "Yeah, we do." They sent out actually a couple of consultants as a case study, and we got together with the database developer on my team, because we picked a pilot team and I was on the team. Got together with the database developer on my team, myself as the lead developer, the database architect, obviously, and the software architect, and we came together and we put a process into place. And the process wasn't perfect, and because it's only a day and a half spent working on it, but it worked well enough, and it worked within the constraints that we were given, because there were already some policies and procedures in place that we had to worry about. And as a result, we started noticing our deployments start taking less and less time. We started getting down to 5-minute deployments to maybe 20-minute deployments, depending on the amount of changes that we had to make. And because of that, it wasn't that big of a deal to do a deployment. We no longer had to say, okay, it takes us 2 hours to do a deployment, and we have to spend 8 hours preparing our Delta scripts. Okay, well, we only want to release once a quarter. Now we feel more confident releasing once every month, or once a week, or once every 10 days, or something along those lines. And yeah, well, a release every 10 days is not perfect, but it certainly is better than releasing once a quarter. And that's where we kind of got down to. We started building that trust back up. The DBAs really started trusting the process. They could see the audit scripts that were being generated by the tooling, and they could download it from Octopus Deploy. They felt really good with that. Now, here's a fun fact while we're doing this is, and we kind of mentioned this, we were doing this without realizing this is what DevOps was. We never had put a name to it. And these are just some practices that you can adopt, and there's not like you have to adopt these exactly. And that's DevOps. DevOps is really about working together. And the other thing I want to make sure that I point out is that we keep setting new goals. Okay, we solved the automated database deployment problem, and that got our deployments a little bit faster, but it wasn't 100% perfect. In fact, we kept tweaking that process about once a month, once every couple of months, to add in some new feature or some other new problem. I solved some other new problem that we came across. So we kept setting new goals, and you want to keep on doing that as you're working together as a development team and an operations team. You keep setting these new goals. Solve one problem or solve a couple problems at a time, and make your lives a little bit better. Talk about some benefits that I've seen in the real world. First, I want to talk about Octopus Deploy and how we release. So we release as soon as a feature is ready. And we have a monthly release cycle for major features. And then we do daily releases of bug fixes. We have some performance tweaks we made, UI improvements. And the way we were able to do that is we used release bots, TeamCity, Slack, and Octopus Deploy, and combined all of that, we build those MSIs that we can then ship out to the customer. So in a nutshell, we use Octopus Deploy to deploy Octopus Deploy. And it doesn't take very long to release. In fact, if you go on our Slack channel, there's a specific Slack channel that you can ask the release bot to go ahead and deploy. It takes a few minutes. It's actually kind of funny to watch the interactions. And by doing that, we're able to respond to our customers' feedback much quicker. An example of this was we got a bug was reported by one of our customers that had happened a couple of times to them in a couple week span, that because of some random set of circumstances would actually stop their deployments from occurring, and it was driving them obviously very crazy when that happened. So they let us know about this issue on a Tuesday morning US time, and we were able to acquire their logs and look through their logs, and we discussed the bug during the day. And when the engineers came online Tuesday night at US time, it would be Wednesday morning Australian time, they were able to identify what the issue was. They had a fix put in place that night, that Tuesday night US time, and they were able to have the fix into the customer's hands by Wednesday morning. The customer wasn't very happy that the bug happened, but they're happy that we were able to get that fixed to them as soon as we were. Another example I like to bring out is what I like to call a successful failure. Back to the loan origination system at the credit union, we had services started consuming way too many resources, and we had done a release, and little known to us, we accidentally had a JavaScript change that went in that increased our throughput by like 1,800%. Unfortunately, that crashed our servers because we couldn't handle that load. But before that crash occurred, our operations team, they noticed this using New Relic, and they were able to notify, hey, there's a problem, you need to start triaging. Well, we started triaging the issue, but unfortunately, we couldn't solve the issue fast enough, and all the servers stopped responding. The unfortunate thing was those servers not only hosted the loan origination system, but also hosted a number of other applications. Well, we were able to start applying workarounds to get the other applications working, and we were able to put a Band-Aid fix in place within a couple hours and released out to our customers or out to our users. But the reason I like to bring this up was we started triaging this issue. We started solving this problem before the first support ticket started coming in. And by the time the support tickets did start coming in, we already had a response that the support people could tell them, yes, we're aware of this. We're working on a workaround right now. We'll let you know as soon as it's ready situation. But by doing that, we could be a lot more proactive in our performance improvements. Same application, we did a release, and we noticed one of our methods response time went from 20 milliseconds to 200 milliseconds. This was on a dashboard. It was updating counts throughout the day. It wasn't like someone was going to notice that unless they had like the Google Chrome networking tools open and they're just monitoring that like crazy person. But as a development team, we're able to identify that issue and identify the slow performance and fix that before it became a bigger issue. Because what happens if it goes to 400 milliseconds or 2 seconds or 20 seconds? Then it's not a good response. Then it's not a good user experience. Some roadblocks as you're going to be starting down this journey. The first thing is people. One of the things that I thought was just rather funny while we started doing this, and this is really with automated database deployments, was people really don't like to change. A perfect example I like to give is my wife and how she downloads her photos from her phone, from her iPhone onto her MacBook. What she does is she just goes in there, selects the photos that she wants, emails the photos to herself, then goes to her MacBook, signs into her email, downloads the photos, renames them, saves them into a very specific folder, and then copies that. And I'm over there scratching my head going, honey, if you use like photos, it's going to, Apple Photos, it's going to solve a lot of your problems. And she's like, no, I tried that. I didn't like it. What I have works for me. And that's kind of some of what you might run into with a lot of other people at your job is, yeah, what I have works great. It's a little bumpy, but it works. It's just, I thought it was rather interesting when we started proposing this change, especially with automated database deployments, because we wanted to make everyone's life better. One particular issue we ran into was the database developers. They were spending a day or two working on these Delta scripts, and suddenly they didn't have to spend that time anymore. So the fear was trying to replace their job. That's not the case at all. We were trying to stop them from wasting their time writing those scripts and focus on more important things, a better table structure or performance improvements, be more proactive rather than sitting there writing scripts or clicking some checkboxes using some tools. Time. You're going to spend quite a bit of time implementing these changes. It just takes time. and does often require multiple iterations to get right, especially if it's rather large change, such as automating database deployments. The first time you start on that process versus what you have after 2 or 3 months, it might look completely different. And you're also going to run into some conflicting priorities. When I worked at the credit union, we had our CEO decided to acquire another credit union in another state. Well, we had our automated database deployment process ready to go. We had done a pilot group. We had released it to a couple teams. People were really happy. We're really getting a lot of good feedback, and we were ready to release it to all the other development teams. Well, we had to make a lot of changes for that acquisition, a lot of software changes, because it's in another state. There were a number of laws that we had to take into account, and we had 10 months to apply those changes. And so automated database deployments was put on the shelf for adopting that for all the other teams. And it's just what it was. But once we were done, we were able to start picking it up again, but it's just something you'll run into. And then finally, cost. Those tools do cost money. Sometimes they're relatively cheap. Some of them might be a lot more expensive, depending on what tool you pick. And then you also have to worry about cost per development hour. Some places that I've worked at, they estimate it's $50 per development hour. Other places it's $100 per development hour. And if that's the case, if you have 2 developers, they work 50 hours on something, that's $10,000. That's how much money it just costs the company in terms of salary, benefits, keeping the lights on, everything like that. If you have a large change that you want to make, you might have to worry about hiring consultants. And as a result, you might see months or years before you get an actual ROI. And to some people who have to worry about budget, that is a bit of a scare. So it is possible, absolutely possible to overcome those roadblocks. The nice thing is the technology is the easy part. We had a working proof of concept for the automated database deployments in probably a day and a half, and then we were able to add it to our pilot group within probably about a week. So it wasn't a ton of time that we had to spend on it, but that was the easy part. The rest of the time was spent really convincing other teams and showing them, like, yep, look how much better it's getting. Look how much faster we're able to deploy. The most important thing is don't shoot for perfection at first. Just know that you're probably going to fail, and you have to iterate through the process. I also believe in providing clear and measurable statistics. So when you pick up hey, we want to solve this one particular problem. We want to solve a performance issue. So you mark down the statistics for that particular method and say, this is how fast it is right now. You make some changes, and then you apply them, and then you can obviously measure those stats. Same thing if you're speeding up your deployments using whatever tool you want to pick out. Before, when you're doing manual deployments, it was taking us 2 hours to deploy. Now it takes us 30 minutes to deploy. I mean, that's a very clear, measurable thing that you can show somebody, especially the decision makers. Like, okay, well, now you're spending 8 hours to write those Delta scripts, and it only takes you 30 minutes now to review that. You just saved someone 7.5 hours. It's a very clear thing that you can show somebody, especially anyone who is concerned about budgets or something like that. Just to kind of summarize some of the benefits, one of the reasons why you still want to overcome those obstacles, because it's kind of a downer to end this talk, was you do end up with faster releases, and you're making better informed decisions, and you can listen to your customer feedback. So you know that, hey, we need to make performance improvements over here. Our customers say that we need to tweak the UI over here. They want this new feature, whatever the case may be. We can adjust to market demands. One of the best examples I can think of recently was, Docker came into the world, and it's been quite a disruptive force. So what's the next disruptive force that's coming out there? Can we respond to that? Whatever you make, can you take advantage of something like that? And then in the end, Steve kind of mentioned this a bit, was less stress. And I can absolutely agree to that, because I used to be on an on-call rotation many years ago, and it was a BlackBerry phone. That kind of indicates how long ago this was. And if I hear the default BlackBerry ringtone, I still get heart palpitations. I'm ready to go. Like, I get a surge of adrenaline because of that stress that was causing me. And with larger releases, we had a lot of stress, but now we have smaller releases, and I don't feel as worried about that. I can see these tools taking advantage of. I take advantage of all these tools to lower my stress level. That made me a lot happier. So, thank you for your time. Thank you for listening to me. And I'm going to turn it back over to Steve to see if there's any questions.
All right, Bob, thank you very much. I flipped over. I think you've done a great job love discussing it. And I don't have any questions now, but if anybody has some, please type something in. Bob, you brought up some interesting things there, and one of the things I think I might add to your idea of taking it step by step is when I talk to people about how to get started, they always want some magic solution. I'm sure you see the same thing, right? They expect Octopus to just do something for them, right?
Yeah.
And really what I say is I always turn it back and say, what do you do today? Like, how do you do this today? So if you say, that I need to make sure that I connect to the server and set it to restricted user, as an example, then all we would say is, why don't you just make that part of your DevOps process, right? So you would just, in Octopus, for example, I would run a step that would just say, connect to the server and run alter database, set restricted user. And then I would put a pause in there, and then I would have another step that would say alter database set to all users.
Yeah.
And then I could run my automated process that would make sure that we always set to restricted user. It would then notify me that said, hey, this is done. I could continue to do all my manual work and then say go, and it would turn it back on. And what I always tell people is just the same manual things you do today, one by one, you automate those and just make it better. Right.
Absolutely.
So slowly, you're just taking things out of your process and you're moving it from you having to do it to something like Octopus just doing that for you.
Yeah, that's actually kind of funny. Like at the beginning of our before we do a demo, one of the first questions that we ask is, what is your process that you have today, and then what are you hoping that Octopus can solve for you? Like, tell us some of the manual things that you're doing. Oh, we manually copy files to our web server and then change the web config file. Okay, well, let's start solving that one particular problem and make your life a little bit better.
Right. I mean, and that's the thing that you can do. Now in database, I know you get more difficult, but ultimately for me, I also have had luck with talking with people who say, why don't we just do something in parallel? So let's build, well, so as an example, let me pop something up here because I've actually got it. So I've got Management Studio. What I'll do is say, create procedure, get one, select one. And then I'll say, let's deploy this because this isn't going to affect your application. This isn't going to break anything. But this kind of thing allows you to build a process that you're confident can work. And you could deploy, you're a database guy, right? So we know that procedures, views, functions are much easier to deploy than table changes. So why don't we just deploy those, right?
Yeah.
So
let
me, go ahead, Bob.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. No, I was going to say, one thing that we do talk about is, I remember we were talking about in our processes was, okay, what can we change to make it so we can deploy our databases in the middle of the day? So you talked about, hey, let's make a small procedure change. That's a lot easier to deploy. Or if we do want to deploy a table change, like we want to add a new column, okay, let's maybe make it a nullable column and just add it out there and just to see.
Yeah. So here, let me ask you this, Bob, because we have a question from Paul. He asked, do you find a model-based approach easier than a migration approach, or vice versa? You're a database guy, right?
Yeah. So that I think starting out, I think a model-based approach is probably the best one because it's a lot easier, especially if you're using Redgate's tooling, because it integrates right with SSMS, and you don't have to change a whole lot within your process. And it gets you very, very comfortable with everything. But after a while, I think you can kind of graduate more to a scripting changes because you feel more comfortable and you feel confident in what you built out so far. Yeah.
So what I would say, Paul, is that I find that ultimately for the human, the model-based approach is easier, especially as Bob mentioned for the beginners, because they don't want to track all their changes. They want to have them bundled up and have some tool look at the models and determine what the differences are. Okay. The thing I find is that unless you're doing fairly simple changes, like I'm just doing views and procs and I only add columns, the model-based approach has some just fundamental domain holes in how it handles things. For me, I like the migration approach better because ultimately, when I review a script as a DBA or anybody, if I'm a developer and I give it to the DBA, they're reviewing the migrations that are taking place, right? And they're going to get them all bundled together because I'm not going to give a DBA, here's the old table and here's the new table. What do you think, right? What I'm going to do is give them the alter table, add column, drop constraint, whatever it is. And so ultimately, I think for most of us, we think in terms of migrations. What we don't like to do is worry about capturing all those changes. And so that's where tooling helps the migration approach, because
Yeah.
tons of developers love the migration.
Mhm.
The founder of Octopus, Paul, actually wrote DB Up, which is a migration runner. Rails has migrations, EF has migrations, Flyway, Liquidbase, SQL change automation from Redgate. We all do migration stuff, but for the individual, we sometimes feel as a developer it's too hard to track it.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say, right, and you've probably run into that, Bob, is that as a developer, I do a lot of stupid things.
Yeah.
And so if I'm tracking all these migration scripts, I need a way to easily weed out the stupidity that I've added. And
Yeah.
so that's something I haven't seen anybody solve very well. Personally, I don't consider migration scripts immutable. So when I realize there's stupidity in there, I edit that migration script and I either undo the change, now with SQL provision, I just rebuild the database and reapply a different migration. But, I want to make sure those migration scripts are the proper ones I need. So let me ask you another one. So Andre, sorry, Andre, I'm not sure. What's the best way to make to have your database deployments revert with Octopus? Bob, you got an answer?
So that could be a very dangerous thing depending on what you want to do. If you're using a tool like Redgate, so for their automation stuff, especially if you're using the model-based tool, it will use transactions automatically. So if it fails, it'll automatically roll back your transactions. The thing you really have to worry about is after you do your deployment with your database is how long until you can revert those changes back without causing any damage. Because the second you release that to the users and they start making changes to data, is it acceptable for you to revert those data changes? Like, what data will it destroy? And it's almost a case by case basis, which is kind of the unfortunate thing. What a lot of people end up doing is they will take a backup. So they'll run a script to take a backup of the database at the very beginning of their database deployment process. And throughout their process, they can have everything works. And then at the very end, they'll have a failure step. So if everything fails, go ahead and run the rollback. That seems to work out pretty well for the instantaneous things, but after a while, like it could be 10 minutes, 15 minutes, or a day, you can't really revert those changes. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, I mean, so if you think about how you make changes, some changes, as Bob said, are easy to revert and some aren't, right? If I've allowed data to be changed, I'm in trouble. Now, Octopus keeps track of all your versions, so I could just pick the previous version and redeploy that from Octopus.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is, I have to know what I've done. So if I've changed the definition of objects, so if I've changed views, procedures, functions, redeploying a previous version is no effect really, right? I mean, logically it has to work, but I can easily do that. With tables, it's slightly tricky because it depends on what my changes are. If I've just added a column, I can easily drop that, right? That's not hard for Octopus to do, depending on how that deployment works, right? Because Octopus is just a step engine, right?
Yeah.
It's fancy, it does a lot of stuff, but your plugin or your coding of that release process is what matters. So if your coding says run the SQL script that says add column, the previous deployment didn't have a script in there that said drop column,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you'd either have to pre-write, what I've seen some people do is do a branch that will do the reverse of their deployment. So it undoes all the changes for the tables, which feels super cumbersome to me.
Yeah,
right?
That's a lot of extra maintenance.
Yeah. For risky tables, what I've always done is had the scripts handy, and I've executed manually, but these days I would actually have a separate pipeline in Octopus that is run these ad hoc scripts, and just like a migrations approach, I would drop some script into a folder and say, make this deployment work, because I still want the auditing, I still want the security, I still want all those things that Octopus or some other tool provides, but I want a way to just do it quickly.
Yeah.
Right. So I think you can do that. If you're doing .NET or some of those other ones, then an Octopus or a release management tool, it's dirt simple because you just grab the previous version and say deploy this instead.
I also recommend adding into your process, whatever you do, make sure you take advantage of the Octopus Deploy artifacts so you can review the rollback scripts before you actually run them. So you don't have you don't have a script in there that you don't know about that's I'm going to drop table, like, oh my gosh, or drop database or something ridiculous.
Right. Yeah. And the other thing, so Paul, I wanted to ask you, or sorry, Bob, I wanted to ask you. I've seen some people that have built two pipelines. So they do one for procedures and views.
Oh, okay.
I guess for functions, but they don't really do functions. And they do one for table changes. So it's really one for table changes and one for everything else.
Okay.
Because code changes are easy to roll back. They're just like C# or Python or something else.
Yeah.
But table changes are more complex. So if I've done a deployment, I can pop back to the previous version of all my procedures and functions and stuff. Tables are definitely trickier.
Yeah.
So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know there's a best way. I think what it is you have to think about what you would do now, and then try to think about how I would automate that moving forward. Like, what would I want to have automated moving forward?
Yeah. I would definitely start as simple as possible with that, because you don't want to make major rollback table changes without understanding what's going to happen. So I like the idea of starting simple with just having procedures and functions, but it'll be tricky just to filter out. I mean, you can use with Octopus, you can have a different, you can have the same process handle both of those, or the same project, excuse me, but take advantage of the channel functionality and scope variables to the different channels. So you could have the default channel releases everything, and then maybe you have just script store procedure function, which only does store procedures and functions, so to speak.
Right. Yeah. So whatever plugin, whatever process you use, that would have to account for filtering somehow.
Oh yeah, absolutely, definitely.
All right. So I got one last question I want to ask you. So Paul also asked, how do you prevent schema drift between environments? So dev, QA, prod, if you're doing migration scripts, how do you deal with that, Bob?
That is the ultimate question, because you have to run that script. You're going to have to make sure you run those checks. There's also, originally, I think it was called SQL Lighthouse. Was that what that tool was called?
Yeah, it's the DLM dashboard now.
Yeah, that when a change was made, it would notify people of that happening.
Yeah, I mean, Paul, what I'd say in the past, what I've used is a stick. So meaning that we go yell at somebody or have trouble. So prod is always hard. So I think for prod, you're always going to have schema drift, because when something is broken or something has to be changed, you just have to do it. There's just I think no matter how smooth I've seen DevOps processes in place, somebody's always going to end up touching something in production, right? Indexes for sure.
Oh yeah.
Sometimes data may be next. Maybe once in a great while they have to make a quick schema change that got missed in a deployment, but ultimately it just has to happen, and so you can't prevent it, right? The thing is, you have to be sure it's fed back. So you need some tooling that tracks this to let you know what happened. And so ultimately, that's why I say, like, I would love, my view has evolved to say, I always want two pipelines to production. So one for DBAs so they can do ad hoc stuff, and one for development stuff.
Yeah.
So that way, if the DBA's got to do something quickly, we can pop it through there, but we have auditing to know what happened.
So in that particular case, do you have basically the same is it the same project that you have, and then you're just using different channels, or how does that work?
No, I would use a separate project. So so in the Redgate tooling area, what I would say is I would have a project for developers that does most stuff, but likely I would filter out things like security, cryptographic, certain classes of objects that are always different in production than development. So the developers just wouldn't deal with that stuff, because it would always be filtered out, and any kind of weird thing they did would not go through. And then the DBA side, I would have a project that does the reverse filter, so it only does those objects. But I would also include a mechanism to just do ad hoc scripting. So if I drop a script somewhere, really in the migrations approach, right, because those are the run once scripts, I just say, here's a script I need to run that says, alter table or, update table set value equal X where value equals Y. Run that through the process quickly, and not so much for the testing aspect of it, but more for the auditing aspect of what did I just do?
Yeah. I guess, because one thing that I come from a background of, I like having my tool handle a lot of that audit, like you talked about security and everything like that. Once you kind of come up with because most places I've worked at, you kind of have like a set standards, like, okay, we're going to use integrated security, or if you have to use, SQL users for whatever reason, having that kind of that standard set in place. And at that point, I like having the tool like Octopus Deploy enforce those standards. So I'm going to create a new project, and it will automatically create the database for me. If it doesn't exist, it will create the user for me following these standards, and it'll do all that work for me. That way I don't have to think about that ever again, to set it up once situation.
Yeah, and that's the idea. Like having a second pipeline for me is just a way of doing that kind of stuff quickly. It's still tough because a lot of times you're querying production to look for something to do, but at least it allows me to get some auditing in there. For QA, I just beat people up and say, you can't change anything on QA. It has to come through development. Ultimately, that's just the way you say, if you find a bug, you can't just fix it in QA.
One way to definitely get around that particular problem once you start automating your database deployments is we enforced local database development. You have to use local database development or a dedicated environment, because that has so many more benefits. Branching, you can mess around with stuff and you're not affecting anybody else. Well, once you started doing that, you can lock down all those environments except to the DBAs, so you can't go in and make those changes.
Yeah, and same here. Like we just, when developers complain, we're like, you just have to do a better job building code that goes to QA, right? I mean, you can't just go, we didn't feel like fixing that, so we're just fix it in QA. So I do that. The last thing I'll just leave with, Paul just says he uses snapshot backups to do quick rollbacks. Using compare to get the thing. Paul, I actually do that too. So when I do deployment, like in something like Octopus, sometimes I may have a backup in there. Sometimes that's not feasible for deployments to actually make a backup because of time constraints. But the first step for me would typically be to compare a snapshot of the previous deployment with the current version on production of schema, and then let me know if there's any issue. And then the last step of the deployment would be to create the new snapshot from production of what we just deployed. That way I can detect drift and just understand if something is different and hasn't been fed back to development.
One of the things that we're adding in recently, it's coming down, it's in our pipeline right now, is this whole concept of maintenance tasks. So they're not really tied to deployments, but they're tied really just to it's stuff like this, or people want to install Windows patches, or they want to do something along those lines.
Right.
And I think having a maintenance task go in there and kind of work with your snapshots and detecting that drift, I think that would be a very big use case for that, because if it does detect it, then it could fail and send out notifications saying, hey, something has changed.
No, and that's a good point. Like for me, I don't fail it. I want to review it, because it's possible we drifted in production and we've already fed it back to development and it's coming through, right? So it'll come through as a no op, but it will certainly tell us that something happened. So in any case, there's lots of ways to do it. If you've got further questions or ideas or something, please contact us. One thing I want to do before we go is, at Redgate, we've been starting to do research to help both us understand as well as customers. And we've produced a state of database DevOps report. This is the third one I think we've done now. This is similar to what Puppet Labs does every year for their state of DevOps report, but we're specifically with databases. So if you'd like to get that, you can download it from the Redgate site. And then if you've got questions, you can always contact us, devops@redgate.com, and certainly we have solutions. Octopus Deploy is out there. I apologize, Bob, I didn't have the link on here, but Octopus is a great solution for deploying changes for any software, not just databases, but C#, Python, Java, web, whatever it is. Okay. So with that, I think we'll end it. Bob, thank you very much for giving us a presentation today.
You're welcome.
Yeah, it was good. Hopefully we'll do some more of these in the future. And again, everybody should get a copy of the video and the slide deck. But if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us. Thanks a lot for attending, and hopefully we'll talk to you or see you soon.